A black billionaire loses what money can't buy, his daughter's voice. In silence, he meets a woman with no title and learns presence can heal what power never could. Malachi Creed had once stared down senators, CEOs, and even death itself, but nothing prepared him for the sound of his daughter's silence. The night Zahara stopped speaking, New York didn't notice. The markets stayed open. The trains kept running. But in the Creed penthouse, time folded in on itself like a paper swan dipped in fire. No screams, no tears. Just the hollow rhythm of a child rocking on the floor, tracing circles no one else could see. He buried his wife with orchestras, with donations, with granite, but he could not resurrect the voice of their daughter. Harvard couldn't. AI programs couldn't. God, it seemed, didn't answer billionaires. Then, a woman from Harlem, cleaning blood from the marble floor of his office at 3 a.m., left behind a flash drive. No note, just music. And when Zahara heard it, she turned her head. Not to her father, not to the sound, to something older, something waiting. Malachi Creed had once stared down senators, CEOs, and even death itself, but nothing prepared him for the sound of his daughter's silence. The night she went mute, the Dow Jones Industrial Average rose 200 points. His hedge fund crossed $8.4 billion. America, as usual, kept marching. No pause for grief, no mercy for those with palaces and broken hearts. But inside a glass tower above Manhattan, a 6-year-old girl stopped answering the world. Her name was Zahara. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply went still, like a flame folding in on itself, refusing to burn. Her mother had died 3 days earlier in a private oncology wing filled with machines that whispered and beeped like dying birds. Malachi held her hand as it grew cold. But Zahara had been the one to vanish truly. She didn't touch food. She didn't respond to the light. She began humming to herself in a low, rhythmic tone, as if something ancient were trying to remember its way home. For 18 months, Malachi threw everything he had at the silence. Neuroscientists, behaviorists, immersive VR therapy, even experimental treatments whispered about in Swiss research labs. Nothing worked. The room stayed quiet. The girl got lost. But there was one thing he never tried. Not because it didn't exist, but because it didn't make sense. Something old, illogical, and human. Something no algorithm could replicate. Presence. The day he met Ezi Nyame, she wasn't on his calendar. A top clinician didn't refer her. She wasn't even supposed to be in the building. She was a cleaner assigned to late-night maintenance on the 74th floor. Elderly. Ghanaian. A woman who spoke with her hands more than her voice and smelled faintly of shea butter and sandalwood. What caught his attention wasn't her words. It was the sound. At 3 a.m, as he walked the halls like a ghost, Malachi heard a strange melody coming from an empty conference room. No instruments, just the hollow pat of hand against skin, the thrum of fingers drumming against a mop bucket, a low hum beneath it all. It wasn't music. It was a memory set to rhythm. She didn't stop when he walked in. She looked at him, nodded once, and kept playing. He should have dismissed her and called security. Instead, he stood there for 10 whole minutes, hypnotized. It was like watching someone sew torn air back together. The next morning, a flash drive appeared on his desk. No note, no explanation, only one file. For her. At first he assumed it was misplaced. Then he played it. It was raw, unproduced. A lullaby layered with heartbeat rhythms and wind chimes, recorded under a tree or inside a clay-walled hut. There were no lyrics, only breath. He set it aside. But that night, as Zahara rocked in her silence, he played it again, low, almost unconsciously. And for the first time in nearly 2 years, she turned her head toward the speaker. Her body stilled. Her eyes blinked once. She whispered a single word. Rain. He didn't breathe. He didn't move. He just watched the moment fold time into something impossible. Malachi found Essie 2 days later outside a Harlem church, where she was handing out blankets to children who called her auntie. He told her what happened. She didn't blink, only nodded, like it was never a surprise. "I do not cure," she said. "I remember. And sometimes children do too." He brought her home that night, not as a therapist, not as a consultant, but as something more dangerous, someone who could break the wall money had built. Essie entered Zahara's world like smoke through a crack, soft, patient, unseen. She didn't talk to the girl. She sat near her, matching her breath. Sometimes she tapped stones together. Other times, she sang in a language older than guilt. Within days, Zahara changed. She looked into Essie's eyes. She touched her scarf. She began tapping her fingers in patterns that mirrored those of the older woman. The staff said it was a fluke, a manipulation. The board of Malachi's company whispered behind closed doors, afraid he'd gone soft. But he didn't care. Something was happening. Something sacred. Something no doctor had come close to touching. Then the footage appeared. At 3:07 a.m., Essie was seen walking barefoot in the garden, holding what appeared to be a blood-stained cloth. She looked directly at the hidden camera, didn't flinch, and raised the cloth in silence. The security team flagged it. The headlines wrote themselves. Rumors from Ghana resurfaced. A missing child, no charges, no proof, only shadows. Malachi confronted her. She didn't explain. She laid the cloth on his desk. It was Zahara's, embroidered with sunflowers, thrown from her window during a nightmare. "You're afraid because I don't fit your formulas," Essie said. "But she's not a formula either." He fired her. Zahara stopped speaking again. It would take losing everything, reputation, peace, the fragile bridge he'd started to rebuild, to realize the truth. Some wounds don't heal with force. Some languages can't be translated. Some children need more than treatment. They need someone who remembers how to listen before they speak. And sometimes the only path to redemption begins with a voice you almost didn't hear. Malachi Creed didn't believe in accidents, not in finance, not in life. Everything had a cause, a vector, a price. But the way Essie Niame entered his daughter's world defied all of that. She never asked questions, never offered solutions. She simply arrived each morning before sunrise, her scarf always freshly tied, her voice humming low, like a river remembering its name. The house, once a cold temple of glass and silence, slowly shifted around her presence. Even the walls, somehow, seemed to listen. Zahara didn't speak. Not yet. But something in her eyes had changed. She began placing objects in strange patterns. 3 stones on a windowsill, a folded towel near the door, a feather under a chair. Essie never touched them. She only sat nearby and watched. Sometimes she mirrored the gestures. Other times, she simply breathed. Slow, steady, rhythmic, as if matching the tempo of the child's nervous system. Malachi watched everything from his security room, surrounded by screens and silence. At first, he called it a coincidence. Then, he began to feel it. The quiet was no longer empty. It pulsed. It carried something unnameable. He hadn't realized how much he feared stillness until it became sacred. His board was growing impatient. His name had become a ghost in strategy meetings. Competitors moved in with smiles like knives. His CFO scheduled an intervention about his priorities. And through it all, Zahara continued to arrange her silent symphonies, and Essie kept time. But the outside world was not so forgiving. The night before the Creed Foundation Gala, a celebration of everything he'd built, Amal, Malachi's sister, arrived early. She was pragmatic, well-dressed, and always skeptical of things that didn't fit into clean narratives. She saw Essie guiding Zahara gently through the garden and froze. You trust her this much already? She asked without turning. She hasn't given me a reason not to, Malachi answered. You haven't given her a reason to try. There was something in Amal's tone, a tremor wrapped in steel. Malachi ignored it, but the words festered. That night, while crystal chandeliers caught the light of 100 empty conversations, he excused himself from the party and returned to his study. The monitors were glowing quietly. Zahara was in her room. Izzy sat beside her, drawing on a whiteboard. Zahara held a marker with trembling fingers. She didn't resist when Essie placed her hand over hers to guide the stroke. Then it happened. Zahara turned. Her lips moved. "Ma," she whispered. The sound was fragile, barely a breath, but it landed in Malachi's chest like a thunderclap. He replayed it. Again. Again. "Ma." His daughter had not formed a word in nearly 2 years, and now, in the presence of a woman with no degree, no credentials, only presence, she had spoken. And yet, by morning, the storm had gathered. A member of his security team brought footage from 5 nights earlier. At 3:03 a.m., Essie walked barefoot through the corridor holding a red cloth. She entered the garden, paused by the fountain, and looked directly into the hidden camera. Her stare wasn't accidental, it was known. Malachi's blood ran cold, red. Was it blood? Paint? Something worse? He confronted her that afternoon. She entered the study with her hands folded, her face unreadable. He didn't offer her a seat. "You've been on camera the whole time." "I know," she said softly. "Then why look into it like you have something to hide? Maybe I wanted you to see I don't." She pulled the cloth from her bag. It was Zahara's scarf, sunflowers, frayed edges, the one she'd lost days ago. "She threw it out the window," Essie said. "She cried for it, but didn't have the words, so I went to get it." "You should have told me. Would you have listened?" The words were calm, but they split the room. Malachi searched her face for anything dishonest, anything dangerous. He found none, but the doubt had taken root. Amal's voice returned to him. "She has your daughter calling her Ma." And in that moment, it didn't matter what Zahara needed. It mattered what Malachi feared, losing his role, his control, his meaning. He asked Essie to leave. She did not cry. She did not defend herself. At the door, she said only one thing. "She doesn't need to be perfect. She needs to be safe." Zahara woke hours later. She didn't smile. She didn't hum. She didn't walk to the garden. She lay in bed with her eyes open, neither asleep nor awake. Malachi tried to play the same music. She turned away. He held out her favorite toy. She let it fall. By the 3rd day, Zahara was back where she had started, rocking, silent, humming a song no one could hear. And that's when it hit him. He had mistaken presence for a threat. He had traded magic for management. And he had lost her. Again. Not to death this time, but to fear. And as the city pulsed on beyond his windows, indifferent and bright, Malachi Creed, the man who once controlled markets, sat alone, watching old footage of a woman who had dared to listen simply, and a child who, in her silence, had begged the world to do the same. It was 3 a.m. again when Malachi Creed stood in the glow of the control room, watching the cameras like a priest in front of a silent altar. The monitors played back moments he'd almost forgotten. Zahara tracing invisible circles on the floor, Essie humming something low and ancient, the scarf with sunflowers floating in the garden like a ghost of trust. He had been wrong, and not in the way executives admit failure to shareholders or fathers swallow pride at PTA meetings. No, this was a deeper kind of the kind that rewrites a man's memory in reverse, forcing him to watch love walk out the door while fear applauds from the corner. He called her that morning. It took 4 rings. "You were right," he said. There was silence on the other end. I sent away the one person who truly saw her. Please, come back. A pause. Then Essie spoke, quiet but unshaken. She's not broken. She never was. But now she knows what betrayal feels like. Then help me give her something else, he said. Help me give her the truth. Another pause. I'm already at the gate. By the time Malachi opened the front door, barefoot in linen, eyes hollow from nights without sleep, Essie was there. She did not smile. She didn't need to. Her presence alone calmed the house like a gentle wind after a fire. Behind her, Zahara stood at the top of the staircase. She was clutching the sunflower scarf. Her feet were bare. Her eyes didn't seek her father. They locked onto Essie with the precision of memory. And then, step by step, she descended. The room seemed to breathe for the first time in days. Malachi held his breath. Zahara walked straight to Essie, stopped, and reached up, a trembling hand resting gently on the woman's face. Then, a word. Quiet, but clear. Safe. That one syllable hit like scripture. Not spoken out of vocabulary, but from somewhere deeper, out of experience. Zahara hadn't forgotten. She had remembered who made her feel safe and who didn't. Tears welled in Malachi's eyes, not because of the beauty of the moment, but because it didn't include him. He dropped to one knee, slowly, like a man shedding armor. He reached for his daughter. She didn't retreat this time. She looked at him, really looked, and then leaned into his chest. Not fully, but enough. I'm sorry, he whispered into her hair. I didn't know. I didn't see. Essie knelt beside them, her hand gently resting on Zahara's back. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. For once, silence was the correct language. Later that morning, Malachi gathered his entire staff in the great hall, comprising chefs, security personnel, drivers, and nannies. Amal stood by the window, arms folded. Essie sat quietly with Zahara in her lap. I made a mistake, he began. His voice was steady, but each word cost him something. I doubted someone who brought peace, not a threat. From this day forward, Essie Niame is not a guest in this house. She is family. There was a long pause. Then one maid clapped. Another followed. Idris, the security chief, nodded. Even Amal, though reluctant, lowered her arms. That night, Zahara ate with her hands again. Not clean, not tidy, but joyful. She let rice stick to her fingers and smeared sauce across her chin. Malachi didn't stop her. He just watched, as if witnessing sunlight return to a room that had been dark too long. And before bed, something even stranger happened. Zahara knocked on her father's bedroom door. She didn't speak. She just lifted her arms. He scooped her up without hesitation, and as she nestled into his chest, he whispered, I missed you. Essie stood at the hallway's end, arms crossed, face unreadable. Not proud, not victorious, simply present. This isn't the end, she said. I know, Malachi replied. She'll have hard days. So will I. But now she knows she's not alone. In the following weeks, the house changed, not through design, but through rhythm. Music returned, but not on the sound system. It came from Zahara's mouth, her feet, her laughter. Not constant, not flawless, but alive. Malachi no longer watched through cameras. He watched with his eyes, unfiltered, vulnerable. He began to play piano again, awkward at first, then with more fluidity. Sometimes Zahara would join him, tapping random keys and calling it a song. He never corrected her. He just played along. One evening, months later, he found an old camera tucked behind a bookshelf. He picked it up, weighed it in his hand, and smiled. Then he put it down. There were things worth remembering, not for playback, but for presence. He turned just in time to see Zahara running barefoot through the garden, chasing butterflies. She turned, laughed, and called out a word he hadn't heard in years. "Baba!" That one word, shouted under the fading gold of a New York sun, etched itself into his soul more deeply than any market victory ever had. He didn't record it. He lived it. And in that moment, Malachi Creed, once master of numbers and silence, finally understood the cost of trust and its reward. Not safety, but return. It didn't end with the laughter. It rarely does. Healing, Malachi Creed was learning, wasn't a straight road. It was more like a tide, rising, falling, dragging you forward only to knock you back. Zahara had smiled again, had called him Baba under a bleeding New York sunset. But a week later, she screamed during a thunderstorm and refused to be touched for 2 days. Essie had warned him. She will fold again, but now she knows she can unfold. Malachi, who once traded futures with unshakable logic, now spent his days tracking the mood of a 6-year-old with the reverence of a meteorologist reading clouds. He read books on trauma. He canceled business trips. He stopped timing progress. And most importantly, he stayed. One morning, Zahara placed a small stone in the middle of the dining table. It was smooth, blue-gray, and shaped like a teardrop. She said nothing, just left it there and walked away. When he asked Essie what it meant, she answered without looking up from her tea. "It means she's watching to see if you notice, if you ask, if you care." He kept the stone in his breast pocket for the rest of the week. But not everyone was evolving with him. Amal, his sister, was not cruel, only scared. Scared of being replaced, of losing control, of watching her brother drift into something she couldn't measure. She began to question Issy's presence again, not directly, but with small remarks, notes about overdependence, about emotional entanglement. She called the board behind his back, suggesting Malachi might be slipping. One night, Malachi found her in the library, holding one of the old therapy binders. She looked up with that familiar mix of concern and calculation. "You're losing yourself in her healing," she said. "I'm finding myself in it," he replied. "She calls that woman Ma. What happens when she forgets who her real mother was?" "She's not forgetting," Malachi said, voice sharp. "She's surviving." But the seed had been planted again. That night, Zahara had a nightmare. Malachi rushed in and held her as she cried. When he looked up, Essie was already at the door. No shoes, just presence. She didn't take the child from him. She simply knelt beside them, humming that same low rhythm, the one that had once brought Zahara's first word back into the world. Later, Malachi stood by the window and asked, "How did you find the memory box?" Essie didn't answer immediately. She looked out across the skyline, then said, "She led me there. She touched the wall 3 times. She remembered something you forgot." Malachi nodded slowly. The next day, he gathered the staff again. He told them the truth, not just about Zahara's progress, but about his own mistakes. He named Essie as the child's primary emotional caregiver and asked that she be treated with the same respect as any doctor, therapist, or mentor. But Amal wasn't done. She had made one final call to a former colleague of Issy's in Ghana. She'd asked questions, hinted at unresolved histories, and within days, the past returned in the form of a phone call. Dr. Badu. He was calm, precise, said he'd worked with Essie for years. Then he paused and told Malachi something that rewrote everything again. She lost a child of her own, a daughter. Fever took her before we could intervene. Essie never forgave herself, not because she was responsible, but because she had no chance to save her. When another child under her care disappeared, Amma, it nearly broke her, not because she failed, but because the world blamed her grief. Malachi felt his chest tighten. Why didn't she ever tell me? Because some grief, Dr. Badu said, doesn't speak in words. It speaks in rhythm, in silence, in the way you show up, even when you're no longer invited. That night, Malachi sat in Zahara's room after she'd fallen asleep. He watched her chest rise and fall. In the hallway, Essie stood like a shadow cast in gold. "Why did you come back?" he asked. "I never left," she said. "I waited for you to open the door." He took a deep breath. "You said once that you see pieces of your daughter in every child you help." Essie nodded. "Do you see her in Zahara?" "No," she replied. "Zahara isn't a replacement. She's a bridge. A bridge to what?" "To forgiveness," Essie said. "To yourself." Outside, the wind picked up. Autumn in New York, cold, electric. A new season. Zahara stirred in her sleep, then reached for the edge of the blanket and pulled it to her chest. Malachi tucked her in gently. As he turned out the light, Essie whispered, "She'll be okay." "How do you know?" "Because now she's being seen, and that changes everything." And for the first time since the day his wife died, Malachi Creed turned off every camera in the house, not out of fear, but because he no longer needed proof. He had presence. Some stories don't end, they shift. Zahara didn't wake up one morning cured. There were no trumpet sounds, no banner in the sky. Healing came in quiet returns, fingers tapping against the table, a whispered word, a glance that lingered just a moment longer than before. It was in the way she began walking to the window each morning and waiting for Essie, and not asking. She was just waiting, sure she would come. Malachi no longer watched from behind the screens. He began standing in the doorway instead, coffee in hand, his suit jacket forgotten. Sometimes he sat on the floor beside them, learning how to mimic silence without smothering it. One morning, Zahara brought him a paper she had scribbled on. Nothing legible, just shapes and spirals. He didn't ask what it meant. He only nodded and said, "It's beautiful." She smiled. Essie said nothing, but he caught the flicker of approval in her eyes. For a man who once measured value in numbers and compliance, learning how to witness without defining was his quiet revolution. By fall, Zahara began stringing together fragments of sentences, not always to be understood, but to be heard, and that mattered more. She started naming colors again, purple, gold. She called the sky loud, and her soup cold like the moon. Essie wrote these things down like prayers. They planted a tree together in the garden. Zahara chose the spot, digging with a plastic spoon. Malachi held the sapling as she packed the soil around its roots with her hands. Essie poured water with cupped palms, slow and careful. Afterward, Zahara looked at the tree and whispered, "Grow safe." It was the kind of phrase a child might say, but in that moment, it felt like scripture. In the weeks that followed, Malachi slowly let the outside world back in. The board meetings resumed, but he no longer led with dominance. He listened more. He said, "I don't know," for the first time in a decade, and the room didn't collapse. He no longer measured Zahara's days by what she said or didn't. He measured them by presence. Was she willing to come to the table? Did she look into his eyes? Did she hum when the water ran? These were the new metrics. They weren't made for graphs, but they meant everything. Essie became a part of the house, not as staff, not even as a guest. She was simply there. Her voice became part of the soundscape, her footsteps familiar as rain. When people asked what her role was, Malachi would reply, "She's the rhythm between the words." On the first anniversary of his wife's passing, Malachi sat with Zahara on the rooftop. The city spread below them like a heartbeat made of steel and light. She didn't understand the date, but she knew something felt different. "She's not gone," Zahara said softly, touching her chest. "She's just quiet now." Malachi's throat tightened. He didn't correct her. He didn't say, "She's in heaven," or "She's watching over us." He just placed a hand over his daughter's and whispered, "Me too." It was the most honest thing he had said in months. That night, Zahara brought out the old sunflower scarf and tied it around the base of the tree they'd planted. She called it her memory. Essie nodded and whispered something in Twi, a blessing Malachi didn't understand, but didn't need to. One evening near winter, Malachi walked into the garden and found Zahara stacking stones in a spiral. She looked up at him and said, "This is the safe path. It goes in, not out." He sat beside her. "Can I walk it too?" She nodded. "But only if you listen." And so, step by step, he followed her spiral, slow, unsure, but willing. He didn't record the moment. He didn't share it on any platform. It wasn't a milestone to boast about or a comeback story to monetize. It was something far more valuable, a return to the sacred ordinary. That night, as Zahara fell asleep wrapped in her scarf and silence, Malachi stood at her door with Isi beside him. No words, just breathe. Isi turned to him. "She's not just healing," she said. "She's teaching." "Teaching what?" he asked. "How to stay." And that, Malachi Creed realized, was the one thing he had never known how to do. But now, he was learning. Not as a father with answers, not as a man with control, but as someone finally brave enough to be still. Some mornings felt too quiet, even for a house that had once lived entirely in silence. But now, it was a different kind of calm. Not absence, not fear. More like the hush of a stage just before the curtain rises, or the stillness in a church before the first hymn begins. Zahara woke early now. Not always cheerful, not always speaking, but present. A child who once vanished behind glassy eyes now walked barefoot through the halls, trailing ribbons, stones, and the occasional word. Her speech came in fragments, metaphors, half poems only she understood. But she spoke. That alone was a revolution. On a cold December morning, she stood by the kitchen window, watching frost crawl across the glass. She turned to Essie, who stood near the stove stirring something warm, and said, "The sky forgot its color today." Essie didn't correct her. She just nodded. It remembered slowly. That became a rhythm in the house. Things remembered slowly. Trust, touch, joy, even Malachi. He had changed, not all at once, not dramatically, but undeniably. The man who once answered crisis with a signature now answered pain with silence and space. He no longer asked Zahara to perform healing. He let her unfold, inch by inch, like the fragile edge of a winter flower. The company still ran, but his world no longer revolved around the market. He missed meetings. He prioritized dinner. He walked Zahara to the rooftop garden every evening, even if she didn't say a word. It wasn't about milestones anymore. It was about the keeping. One night, Zahara brought him a piece of broken mirror wrapped in cloth. "From the hallway," she said. "It saw me." He paused. "What did it see?" "Before I remembered how to speak," she whispered. "It saw my quiet." He didn't try to explain it away. He simply held the shard, then asked, "Do you want to keep it or let it go?" She thought for a long time, then placed it on the table and walked away. That night, Malachi tossed it into the river near their old brownstone. An unceremonious release, no ceremony, no speech. But he felt something loosen in his chest, like a knot finally deciding it had served its purpose. Spring came early that year. Zahara called it soft thunder. The tree they planted bloomed with fragile white flowers, and she named each petal. The garden became her map, a space where sound wasn't required for understanding. She'd line up her dolls, whisper stories, and Issy would sit nearby, not interpreting, not intruding, just holding the silence like a lantern. One day, Zahara asked if they could invite her classmates over, not all of them, just the quiet ones. Malachi agreed, though his heart raced. He worried about noise, chaos, the return of a panic he didn't know how to name. But when they arrived, Zahara didn't hide. She offered them sticks to draw in the dirt. She said things like, "The ground listens," and "You don't need to talk to be friends." And they understood. Essie stood by the garden gate that day, arms folded, watching with the grace of someone who knew her part had always been to begin the music, not conduct it. Later that evening, Malachi sat beside her on the steps. "I think she's showing others how to be quiet," he said. "No," Essie corrected gently. "She's showing them how to be heard." There was no final miracle, no TED Talk ending. Just a child who hummed now when she was afraid, a father who played the piano without checking his phone, and a woman who asked for nothing except to be allowed to stay long enough for the rhythm to settle. On the anniversary of Zahara's first word, Malachi hosted no gala, no interviews. Instead, he invited Essie and Zahara to the rooftop. He lit one candle. Zahara placed a stone beside it, and for a while they said nothing. Then Zahara whispered, "This is where she lives now," pointing to her chest. Malachi nodded. She never left. And in the pause that followed, Essie closed her eyes. The wind moved gently through the garden like an old lullaby returning home. That night, when Malachi tucked Zahara into bed, she stopped him before he turned off the light. "Don't close the door all the way," she said. "Let some quiet stay." And he did. Not because he feared the dark, but because he had learned, finally, fully, that not all light is loud, and not all healing needs to be explained. Some stories end in sound. Theirs ended in person. Some stories change the world. Others change one's soul. And that's more than enough. Zahara didn't need fixing. She needed someone to sit with her in the quiet until the quiet stopped being terrifying. Essie didn't arrive with solutions. She came with rhythm. And Malachi, powerful, proud, broken, finally chose to stay. That was the real miracle. This story is not about a diagnosis. It's about a decision. To listen. To surrender. To love when it's inconvenient, when it's messy, when it's not returned right away. Maybe someone in your life is humming their pain in a language you've never learned. Maybe your silence is louder than you think. If this story stirred something in you, don't scroll past it. Share it. Comment. Let us know. When was the moment you realized that staying is more potent than solving? And if you haven't yet, subscribe to our channel. We don't tell stories to impress you. We ask them to remind you you're not alone. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next video.